Elena Toretti never imagined that breaking into the Vatican would be the moment her life changed forever. But as she slipped through the ancient corridors at 2:30 a.m., desperation had already rewritten every rule she'd ever lived by. The woman who once taught art history to university students now moved like a shadow through the holiest halls on earth, her academic knowledge of Renaissance architecture serving as a roadmap to salvation or damnation. The Vatican's corridors stretched before her like the throat of some sleeping leviathan, marble walls gleaming pale as bone in the thin moonlight that filtered through stained glass windows. Each footstep, despite her careful placement, seemed to echo with the weight of centuries, as if the stones themselves were keeping score of every sin committed within these sacred walls. Elena pressed her palm against the cool marble, steadying herself as her heart hammered against her ribs with the desperate rhythm of someone who had nothing left to lose. 6 months ago, she had been Dr. Elena Toretti, respected professor with tenure and a comfortable life built on scholarly pursuits and quiet dignity. 6 months ago, her mother Isabella had been tending her garden, her weathered hands coaxing roses to bloom in their small courtyard. Now Isabella lay dying in a hospital bed, her body ravaged by a cancer that demanded treatments costing more than Elena earned in 3 years. The irony wasn't lost on her, stealing from the house of God to save the woman who had taught her to pray. But as Isabella's voice grew weaker each day, asking Elena to promise she wouldn't give up, moral philosophy became a luxury she could no longer afford. The doctors had been brutally clear. Experimental treatment in Germany offered hope, but only for those who could pay the astronomical cost. Insurance wouldn't cover it. The university's emergency fund wasn't enough. Every legal avenue had closed, like doors slamming shut in her face. Elena's fingers traced the outline of the floor plan she had memorized, leading her toward Pope Leo. XIV's private library, where rare manuscripts and artifacts were kept, pieces that certain collectors would purchase without asking uncomfortable questions about provenance. Enough to pay for Isabella's treatment, enough to let her sleep at night, if such peace were still possible after tonight. The corridor curved ahead, and she could see a faint golden glow emanating from what should have been an empty room. Elena's blood turned to ice as she realized that her carefully researched plan had just encountered the one variable she had never considered. Pope Leo XIV himself, awake and present in the very place she needed to be. The door yielded to Elena's touch with barely a whisper, revealing not the empty study she had anticipated, but a private library bathed in the warm, amber glow of countless candles. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls, filled with manuscripts that had survived empires and witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. The air hung heavy with the scent of aged parchment and beeswax, creating an atmosphere so sacred it felt like stepping into the very heart of human knowledge. Elena froze in the doorway, her eyes adjusting to the flickering light as she scanned the room for any sign of movement. The silence stretched like a held breath until she spotted him, a figure in simple white robes seated at an ornate reading desk, his silver hair catching the candlelight as he bent over an ancient text. Pope Leo XIV himself, exactly where her research had promised he would never be at this hour. Every instinct screamed at Elena to retreat, to vanish back into the corridors like smoke, but her feet had become anchored to the marble floor by a terror so complete it seemed to strip away her very ability to breathe. She watched, paralyzed, as the Pope's weathered finger traced lines of text that might have been written by saints or scholars long dead, his concentration so absolute that he seemed unaware of the world beyond the manuscript before him. Elena's mind raced through her options with the desperate efficiency of cornered prey. The nearest valuable pieces were mere steps away. A jeweled reliquary that could fund months of treatment, illuminated manuscripts worth more than most people's houses. She could take what she needed and disappear before he even looked up. But, as she moved forward on trembling legs, her shoulder brushed against an ancient globe mounted on a wooden stand. The soft scrape of metal against wood shattered the library's reverent silence like a stone through stained glass. Pope Leo XIV's head lifted slowly, and when his eyes met hers across the candle-lit space, Eleanor felt the weight of divine judgment settling over her like a shroud. She had expected anger, righteous fury, perhaps fear from an elderly man confronted by an intruder. Instead, she found herself staring into eyes that held only profound sadness and something that looked disturbingly like understanding. "You carry a heavy burden to have brought you here at such an hour," Pope Leo XIV said softly, his voice carrying no accusation, no demand for explanation. He closed the manuscript with deliberate care and rose from his chair with the measured movements of age and authority. "Tell me, child, what darkness has driven you to seek light in such a dangerous place?" Elena's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her body coiling like a cornered animal, preparing to strike or flee. The Pope's gentle words felt more dangerous than any accusation, threatening to crack the brittle shell of resolve she had built around her heart. "Don't," she said, her voice raw with warning. "Don't pretend to understand what you can't possibly know." Pope Leo XIV stepped closer, moving with the unhurried grace of someone who had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of human desperation. The candlelight cast deep shadows across his weathered face, revealing lines carved by years of hearing confessions and carrying the weight of others' sins. "You're right," he said simply. "I don't know your particular pain, but I recognize what it looks like when someone is drowning." The unexpected admission hit Elena like a physical blow. She had armored herself for condemnation, for the cold righteousness of institutional authority. This gentle acknowledgement of her struggle felt like a blade sliding between her ribs, seeking the vulnerable places she had worked so hard to protect. "I'm not here for sympathy," she managed, though her voice trembled with the effort of maintaining its edge. "No," the Pope agreed, his eyes never leaving her face. "You're here for salvation. The question is whether you're trying to save someone else or yourself." Elena's breath caught in her throat. How could he see so clearly into the heart of her desperation? "My mother," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "She's dying, and I can't. I've tried everything legal, everything honest. The doctors say there's hope, but only if—" Her voice cracked like ice under pressure. Pope Leo XIV's expression softened with a compassion so profound it seemed to fill the candlelit space with something approaching peace. "And so you came here, to the house of God, hoping to steal enough grace to keep death at bay." He moved closer still, close enough that Eleanor could see the tears gathering in his ancient eyes. "Tell me her name." "Isabella," Elena breathed. And with that single word, the last of her defenses began to crumble. The woman who had taught medieval manuscripts and Renaissance art history for 15 years found herself standing in the Pope's private library at 3 a.m, speaking her mother's name like a prayer to the most powerful man in Christendom. "Isabella," Pope Leo XIV repeated, as if testing the weight of the name on his tongue. "A beautiful name. Tell me about her, Elena. Tell me about the woman worth risking your soul to save." The sound of her own name, spoken with such gentle certainty, shattered something fundamental inside Elena's chest, and she realized that whatever happened next would change everything she thought she knew about justice, mercy, and the price of love. Dawn crept across the Vatican gardens like a hesitant blessing, painting the ancient pathways in shades of rose and gold. Eleanor found herself walking beside Pope Leo XIV along a gravel path lined with olive trees, their footsteps the only sound in the sacred stillness. The impossibility of her situation wasn't lost on her. Hours ago, she had been a thief in the night, and now she moved through the Pope's private gardens like some trusted confidant, sharing the weight of secrets she had carried alone for months. It started as a cough, Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt foreign after so many sleepless nights of keeping the full truth locked inside her chest. Just a persistent cough that wouldn't respond to antibiotics. I begged Mama to see a specialist, but she kept saying we couldn't afford to worry about every little thing. Elena stopped beside a marble fountain, its gentle murmur mixing with the distant chimes of morning prayers. 2 months I let her convince me it was nothing. 2 months that might have changed everything. Pope Leo XIV remained silent, his presence steady as the ancient stones beneath their feet. A sparrow landed on the fountain's edge, drinking peacefully, while Elena's world continued to fracture around the edges. Pancreatic cancer, Elena continued, the diagnosis still feeling like a curse word in her mouth. Stage 3, aggressive but treatable with experimental therapy in Munich. The doctors speak in survival percentages and treatment protocols, but all I hear is my mother asking why she feels so tired all the time. Her voice cracked with the weight of months held back. She still tries to cook for me, even though the smell of food makes her nauseous, still asks about my students, even though I had to take leave to care for her. The Pope's weathered hand found the fountain's marble edge beside Elena's trembling fingers. And the cost of this treatment? 80,000 euros, Elena whispered, the number hitting the morning air like a physical blow. My entire life savings bought us 3 months of palliative care. The university's emergency fund covered another month. I've sold everything I own, borrowed against my pension, even tried crowdfunding. A bitter laugh escaped her. Turns out dying professors don't generate the same sympathy as dying children. The sun was fully visible now, casting long shadows across the garden, while Elena's carefully constructed life lay in ruins at her feet. She still believes I can fix this. Every morning she asks if I've heard from the German clinic, if the insurance company has reconsidered, if there's been any good news. Elena turned to face Pope Leo XIV, her eyes red-rimmed, but blazing with desperate determination. So yes, I came here to steal from you, from God himself if necessary, because what kind of daughter would I be if I didn't try everything? Pope Leo XIV's next words would either condemn her or offer something she had stopped believing in: hope. The Pope's private study felt like stepping into the mind of a scholar saint. Ancient texts lined mahogany shelves that stretched toward a frescoed ceiling, while morning light filtered through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like prayers made visible. Elena sat rigid in a leather chair that probably cost more than her monthly salary, watching Pope Leo XIV settle behind an ornate desk with the calm authority of someone accustomed to moving mountains with a word. The Vatican maintains emergency medical funds for extraordinary circumstances, the Pope said without preamble, pulling out a leather-bound ledger that looked older than most nations. 80,000 euros is substantial, but not impossible. I can authorize the transfer this morning. Elena felt reality tilt on its axis, the words hitting her like a physical blow that knocked the breath from her lungs. You're saying you'll just give me the money? The question came out strangled, disbelieving, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever miracle was unfolding before her. I'm saying Isabella deserves every chance at life, and her daughter deserves to sleep at night knowing she didn't have to compromise her soul to save her. The heavy oak door burst open with such violence that it struck the wall behind it, causing a small religious icon to rattle on its mount. Cardinal Santori swept into the room like a storm cloud given. Human form, his scarlet robes billowing with barely contained fury. At 62, he possessed the kind of razor-sharp authority that could reduce Vatican accountants to trembling apologies with a single glance. Your Holiness, Cardinal Santori said, his voice carrying the chill of alpine winds. "Surely you're not seriously considering what I fear I just overheard." Pope Leo XIV didn't look up from his ledger, his pen moving with deliberate strokes across the ancient paper. "Cardinal Santori, may I present Dr. Elena Torretti?" "Elena, Cardinal Santori oversees our institutional protocols." Elena started to rise, but the cardinal's withering stare pinned her to the chair like a butterfly in a collector's case. "The woman who violated Vatican security last night? The thief you should have turned over to the authorities hours ago?" "The daughter," Pope Leo XIV corrected with gentle steel, "who found herself facing an impossible choice and chose love over law." Cardinal Santori's hands clenched at his sides, his composure cracking like ice under pressure. "Holy Father, with all due respect, we cannot simply distribute funds to every desperate criminal who manages to breach our walls. The precedent this establishes—" "The precedent," the Pope interrupted, his voice carrying an edge Elena hadn't heard before, "is that the Church values human life over institutional procedure. And when this story spreads, when every opportunist in Europe realizes they need only craft a compelling tragedy to access Vatican resources," Cardinal Santori's voice rose like a prosecutor delivering closing arguments, "we'll face chaos within the week." Elena watched the exchange unfold like a spectator at her own trial, hope and despair wrestling in her chest as two of the most powerful men in Christendom debated her mother's fate. The difference between Vatican City and Elena's neighborhood in Centocella was like stepping from paradise into purgatory. Graffiti-scarred apartment blocks reached toward a grey sky like broken teeth, their facades crumbling under the weight of decades and disappointment. Eleanor climbed the narrow stairs to her fourth-floor flat, the Pope's promise of help feeling as fragile as spun glass in this harsh reality where miracles rarely survived past sunrise. "Elena, cara mia, is that you?" Isabella's voice drifted from the small living room, weaker than it had been just yesterday, but still carrying the warmth that had guided Elena through every crisis of her 38 years. "Yes, Mama, I'm home." Elena found her mother curled on their threadbare sofa, a colourful headscarf covering her thinning grey hair, reading a worn copy of Dante with the concentration of someone trying to forget her own inferno. "How are you feeling?" "Better today," Isabella lied with the practiced ease of mothers everywhere, though the dark circles under her eyes told a different story. "Did you hear anything from the university about your leave extension?" Before Eleanor could answer, 3 sharp knocks echoed through the thin walls, too aggressive for neighbors, too rhythmic for delivery men. Eleanor's blood turned to ice. She recognized that sound from the desperate months when she had borrowed money from people who didn't accept late payments or sob stories. "Stay here, Mama. Keep reading." Elena kissed her mother's forehead, breathing in the faint scent of lavender that had always meant safety. The men in the hallway looked like shadows given human form, black leather jackets despite the afternoon. Eat faces that might have been carved from the same stone as ancient Roman statues, but without any trace of nobility. Matteo Rossi stepped forward, his smile sharp enough to draw blood. "Elena, Professoressa, you've been avoiding our calls." Matteo's voice carried the deceptive warmth of a snake before it strikes. 2 weeks overdue on the installment. The interest is becoming uncomfortable. I told you, I need more time." "Time?" Bruno, the larger man flanking Matteo, cracked his knuckles like breaking bones. "Sick mothers don't wait, neither do broken legs." Elena stepped into the hallway, pulling. The door closed behind her. "Keep your voices down. She doesn't know about the loan. Doesn't know her daughter borrowed 15,000 euros from people like us?" Matteo examined his manicured fingernails with theatrical interest. "How touching. Family secrets." He leaned Closer, and Elena could smell expensive cologne mixed with something darker. 18,000 now, with interest. Today, I'm getting the money. I have a legitimate source. Legitimate, Matteo laughed, a sound like glass shattering. You tried legitimate, Professor Essa. Legitimate got you here, begging money from loan sharks. His expression hardened. You know what happens to professors who don't pay. We've made examples before. Through the thin door, Eleanor could hear Isabella humming softly, the same lullaby she had sung when Eleanor was small and afraid of thunderstorms. Now Elena faced a different kind of storm, one that threatened to destroy everything the Pope's unexpected mercy had just made possible. The Vatican press office had transformed into a battlefield. Camera flashes erupted like artillery fire as journalists from every major network on Earth crowded into the Sala Stampa, their voices creating a cacophony that seemed to shake the Renaissance frescoes themselves. The story had broken at dawn through a leaked Vatican security report. Pope Leo XIV gives €80,000 to night intruder instead of pressing charges. Cardinal Santori stood at the podium like a man facing his own execution, his usually immaculate appearance showing hairline cracks under the relentless assault of questions. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning, and his hands gripped the marble lectern with enough force to leave fingerprints in stone. Your Eminence, is it true that His Holiness personally authorized funds for a criminal's medical expenses? Cardinal Santori, what message does this send about Vatican security protocols? Are we to understand that breaking into the Pope's private library is now a valid fundraising strategy? Each question landed like a physical blow, and Santori's composure, legendary among Vatican insiders, began to fracture along the edges. His Holiness has always demonstrated exceptional compassion for those facing desperate circumstances. Compassion or catastrophic judgment? The voice belonged to James Mitchell from BBC World, his tone sharp enough to cut marble. Conservative Catholics worldwide are calling this an abdication of papal authority. How do you respond to claims that Pope Leo XIV has essentially put a price tag on Vatican break-ins? In his private study, Pope Leo XIV watched the coverage unfold across multiple screens, arranged like windows into a world gone mad. Each monitor showed his face beside Elena's university photograph, the one from her faculty page, where she smiled with the confidence of someone whose biggest worry had been grading doctoral dissertations. The headlines scrolled beneath in a dozen languages. Pope rewards thief, Vatican security compromised, mercy or madness. His phone rang incessantly. Cardinals from 6 continents demanding explanations, Vatican department heads requesting emergency damage control meetings, and his chief of staff practically begging for guidance on managing what the media had already dubbed the Vatican scandal. But Pope Leo XIV sat in perfect stillness, his weathered hands folded in prayer, seemingly unmoved by the hurricane of criticism swirling around him. On one screen, a panel of theologians debated whether his actions constituted pastoral care or institutional suicide. On another, financial experts calculated the potential cost if Vatican break-ins became a trend. A soft knock interrupted his meditation. Cardinal Santori entered without waiting for permission, his scarlet robes disheveled and his face bearing the particular exhaustion that came from defending the indefensible to a hostile world. Holy Father, the College of Cardinals is demanding an emergency session. 3 major donors have threatened to withdraw funding. The Archbishop of Dublin has issued a public statement questioning your... Santori paused, choosing his words like a man walking through a minefield. Your fitness for continued leadership. Pope Leo XIV finally looked up, his eyes holding the same serene certainty they had shown in the candlelit library with Eleanor. And what do you think, Cardinal? Am I fit to lead? The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and fading hope. Isabella lay motionless in the narrow bed, her breathing shallow and labored under the tangle of tubes and monitors that had become her electronic lifeline. The cheerful yellow walls, painted to comfort sick children, seemed to mock the gravity of what was unfolding within them as Elena watched her mother slip away by degrees. Dr. Benedetti emerged from behind the monitors, his face bearing the particular exhaustion that came from delivering impossible news to desperate families. Elena stood beside Isabella's bed, like a sentinel guarding a treasure she was powerless to protect, her hand wrapped around her mother's frail fingers. "The cancer has accelerated beyond our projections," Dr. Benedetti said, his voice professionally, gentle but brutally honest. "We need to begin the Munich protocol immediately, or—" He didn't finish the sentence. The machine's steady beeping filled the silence with electronic urgency. Elena felt the world narrow to a pinpoint of desperate clarity. "How immediately?" "The flight to Munich leaves in 6 hours. The treatment center is holding a slot, but only until midnight. After that—" The doctor's hands spread helplessly. "I'm sorry. I know the Vatican funding hasn't been finalized." "It has been." The voice came from the doorway, calm and certain as cathedral bells. Pope Leo XIV stood there, in simple white robes, flanked by 2 Vatican officials carrying leather briefcases. His presence seemed to fill the clinical space with something indefinable. Not quite peace, but the possibility of it. Elena's throat constricted with emotion she couldn't name. "Your Holiness, you didn't need to come." "A daughter fights for her mother," the Pope said simply, approaching Isabella's bedside with the reverence reserved for sacred ground. "A mother sacrifices everything for her child. These are not extraordinary acts. They are the most human things in the world." He looked down at Isabella, her pale face serene despite the tubes and wires. "And sometimes grace finds a way to meet love halfway." One of the Vatican officials opened his briefcase, withdrawing documents that seemed to glow with possibility. "The transfer to the Munich facility has been completed. Medical transport has been arranged." Through the room's window, Elena could see protesters gathering outside the hospital, some supporting the Pope's decision, others condemning it. Signs reading "Saint" or "Sinner" and "Vatican thieves" bobbed in the crowd like accusations made manifest. "The whole world is watching." "This," Elena whispered, her voice thick with gratitude and terror, "they're calling you mad for helping us." Pope Leo XIV placed a gentle hand on Isabella's forehead, and Elena watched her mother's labored breathing ease slightly. "Let them watch," the Pope said quietly. "Sometimes the world needs to remember what love looks like when it refuses to surrender." As if summoned by his words, Isabella's eyes fluttered open, focusing on the man in white with startling clarity despite 18 hours of unconsciousness. "Elena?" Isabella's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the hospital room's electronic symphony like a bell struck in silence. Her eyes, which had been clouded with fever and medication for days, suddenly focused with startling clarity on the man in white standing beside her bed. "Is this the angel you told me about?" Pope Leo XIV leaned closer, his weathered face gentle as morning light filtering through stained glass. "Hello, Isabella. I've heard you raised a remarkable daughter." Isabella's pale lips curved into the faintest smile, and Elena watched in amazement as color seemed to return to her mother's cheeks like watercolor spreading across paper. "She always believed in miracles, even when I told her to be practical." Isabella's voice grew stronger with each word, defying every medical prediction. "Are you here to tell me it's time?" "I'm here," the Pope said, taking her frail hand in his weathered one, "because love like yours and Elena's deserves witness." Dr. Benedetti, who had been preparing to discuss the urgent transport arrangements, paused mid-sentence as he watched. His monitors, the numbers that had been steadily declining for weeks, were stabilizing, not dramatically, not in any way that defied medical explanation, but enough to make him lean forward and check his equipment twice. Elena gripped the bed rail, watching her mother's transformation with the desperate hope of someone who had learned not to trust good news. But there was something different in Isabella's eyes. A light that had been dimming for months suddenly seemed to burn brighter, as if fed by some unseen source. "Tell me about your work," Pope Leo XIV said, settling into the chair beside Isabella's. Bed with the patience of someone who had nowhere more important to be. "Elena says you were a gardener." "I grew roses," Isabella said, her voice carrying strength that shouldn't have been possible. "Red ones, mostly, but some white ones that bloomed even in winter." She paused, studying the Pope's face with the profound seriousness that came to those standing at life's threshold. "Do you think there are gardens in heaven?" The Pope's eyes glistened with tears that caught the afternoon light streaming through the window. "I think heaven is wherever love refuses to die, Isabella, and your love for Elena, that's already eternal." In the hallway, a nurse was urgently calling for Dr. Benedetti. Through the glass partition, Elena could see medical staff gathering around a computer screen, their faces reflecting something between confusion and wonder. When Dr. Benedetti returned, moments later, his expression was that of a man of science, confronting something that challenged the foundation of his understanding. "I need to run additional tests," the doctor said slowly, his eyes fixed on Isabella. "The blood work from an hour ago shows improvements that shouldn't be medically possible." Isabella reached out and took Elena's hand with strength that had been absent for weeks. "Sometimes," she whispered, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had glimpsed something beyond the visible world, "grace arrives exactly when we stop expecting it." Outside, the protest crowd's chanting grew louder, but in room 314, miracles whispered their presence in steady heartbeats and renewed hope. The phone call came at midnight, shattering the fragile peace that had settled over Elena since Isabella's miraculous stabilization. Matteo's voice slithered through the receiver like oil through water, each word dripping with malevolent promise that made her blood turn to ice. "The whole world knows about your papal charity now, Professoressa. Very touching, but debts don't disappear just because you've found a new friend." A pause filled with the sound of traffic and distant laughter. "Warehouse 47, Via del Porto Fluviale. 1 hour. Come alone, or we visit the hospital." Elena's hands shook as she hung up. Isabella was finally responding to treatment. The doctors speaking cautiously of hope, and the Pope's intervention had given them a future she had stopped believing possible. She couldn't let Matteo's shadow fall across that fragile light. The warehouse district squatted like a forgotten graveyard on Rome's industrial outskirts, where ancient Tiber met modern decay. Elena arrived to find the specified building, a corrugated metal monument to abandonment, its windows dark as dead eyes. 3 figures waited in the amber glow of a single streetlight, their silhouettes sharp as broken glass against the night sky, punctual. I admire that in a woman about to learn hard lessons. Matteo stepped forward, his expensive suit incongruous in the desolate surroundings. Bruno and the third man flanked him like gargoyles come to life, their presence radiating the particular menace that came from men who had crossed lines ordinary people wouldn't even approach. "I'll get you the money," Elena said, hating how her voice trembled despite her attempts at courage. "The Vatican transfer is being processed." "The Vatican?" Matteo laughed, the sound echoing off the warehouse walls like breaking glass. You think the Pope's charity extends to your gambling debts, to the money you borrowed for treatments that didn't work before you got desperate enough to break into churches? Before Elena could respond, the quiet rumble of engines filled the narrow street. Two black sedans materialized from opposite directions, their headlights creating a corridor of light that trapped the four figures like actors on a stage of judgment. Car doors opened with military precision, and Vatican security officers emerged, not the ceremonial Swiss guard, but the serious men in dark suits who protected the Pope when he moved through Rome's dangerous underbelly. Behind them, impossibly, Pope Leo XIV himself stepped into the light. "Gentlemen," the Pope said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed by cardinals and kings alike. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding about Dr. Toretti's obligations." Matteo's composure cracked like ice under pressure, his predatory confidence wavering in the face of institutional power he had never imagined confronting. "This is a private matter, old man. Vatican City's jurisdiction ends at its walls." Pope Leo XIV smiled with the patience of someone who had negotiated with world leaders and mob bosses alike. "Perhaps, but mercy recognizes no borders, and grace acknowledges no jurisdiction." He gestured to the security detail surrounding them. "These men are here to ensure that love, not violence, resolves our differences tonight." Elena stood at the podium in a borrowed dress that hung awkwardly on her academic's frame, her hands gripping the marble edges as if they were the only things keeping her upright. Behind her, Isabella sat in a wheelchair, still weak but miraculously stable, her bright headscarf a splash of defiant color against the austere Vatican surroundings. The treatments in Munich had worked beyond all medical predictions, and her presence here was itself a testament to the impossible. Pope Leo XIV had insisted on this public reckoning. "Truth shared in darkness breeds rumors," he had told Cardinal Santori that morning. "Truth shared in light breeds understanding." Now, facing an audience that included hostile cardinals, skeptical world leaders, and cameras broadcasting to hundreds of millions of viewers, Elena began to speak. "3 months ago, I was a thief." Her voice echoed across the square's perfect acoustics, each word landing with the weight of confession. "I broke into the most sacred place on earth not for greed, but for love. I would have stolen from God himself to save my mother's life." A murmur rippled through the audience, like wind through wheat. Cardinal Santori's face remained stone, but something flickered behind his eyes, recognition, perhaps, of a daughter's desperate devotion. "But I found something I wasn't looking for," Elena continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. Her truth to the world. "I found a man who chose mercy over justice, grace over law. Pope Leo XIV didn't just give me money, he gave me back my soul." Isabella raised her trembling hand then, and the square fell silent, as if the very stones were listening. "My daughter was scared," she said, her voice somehow reaching every corner of the vast space. "But this holy man," she gestured toward, "Pope Leo XIV, he showed us that love makes everything possible, even miracles." Cardinal Santori rose from his seat, his movement drawing every eye in the square. For a moment that stretched like eternity, he stood silent, his internal struggle visible on his austere features. Then slowly, deliberately, he began to applaud. Pope Leo XIV watched from the papal throne as the world finally understood what he had known from that first night. Sometimes mercy is the most practical thing of all. 2 years later, the modest office building in Trastevere bore little resemblance to the opulent halls of the Vatican, but it hummed with the same sense of sacred purpose. The Isabella Foundation, named at a cancer survivor's insistence, occupied 4 floors of a converted 17th-century palazzo, its walls lined with photographs of families whose lives had been transformed by what the media still called the Vatican miracle. Elena stood before a floor-to-ceiling window, watching Rome's morning chaos unfold below while reviewing case files that would have broken her heart 2 years ago. Now they filled her with something she was still learning to. Recognize hope backed by action. The foundation had processed over 300 applications in its second year, funding everything from experimental cancer treatments to surgeries for children born with heart defects. Elena, Cara, the family from Naples is here, Isabella announced from the doorway, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had appointed herself the foundation's unofficial greeter. Her hair had grown back in silver waves that framed a face that still bore traces of her battle, but radiated the particular joy of someone who had stared death down and won. Elena turned to see Maria Conti clutching her 5-year-old son, Luca, both of them wearing the particular expression of desperate hope she recognized all too well. Maria's letter had been one of dozens that arrived daily. Luca needed heart surgery that would cost more than Maria made in 10 years. "Mrs. Conti," Eleanor said, gesturing toward the comfortable chairs arranged near her desk, "please sit. Tell me about Luca." As Maria began her story, the familiar litany of medical bills, insurance denials, and impossible choices, Eleanor felt the weight of responsibility that had become both her burden and her blessing. Each family reminded her of her own desperate night in the Vatican, but now she sat on the other side of the equation, wielding the power to transform despair into hope. The soft chime of her phone interrupted Maria's narrative. Pope Leo XIV's name appeared on the screen, and Elena excused herself to take the call in the hallway. "Elena, my friend," the Pope's familiar voice carried warmth across the connection. "How are we doing with the Palermo family?" Elena smiled at the "we." Pope Leo XIV insisted on reviewing every major case personally. "The surgery is scheduled for next week. Little Giuseppe should be walking normally by Christmas." "Excellent. And the funding for the new children's wing in Bologna. Cardinal Santori says the Vatican Bank will have the transfer completed by Friday." Elena still marveled at how Cardinal Santori had become one of the Foundation's fiercest advocates. His initial resistance transformed into protective devotion. "You know," Pope Leo XIV said, his voice carrying a note of reflection, "when I found you in my library that night, I thought I was helping one desperate daughter save her mother. I never imagined we were planting seeds for a garden this large." Through the window, Elena could see St. Peter's Dome rising above Rome's terracotta rooftops, a constant reminder of the night that had changed everything. "Holy Father, there's something I've been wanting to tell you. The night we met, I thought you were saving Isabella, but I realize now you were saving all of us. Every family we help, every child who gets a second chance, it's because you chose mercy over judgment." A comfortable silence settled between them, filled with the weight of shared purpose and the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered. "Elena," the Pope said finally, "do you remember what I told you that first morning in the garden? That grace finds a way to meet love halfway." "I remember. I was wrong about one thing. Grace doesn't meet love halfway. It goes the full distance. We just have to be brave enough to let it work through us." As Elena returned to Maria and Luca, she carried with her the certainty that some transformations ripple outward like stones thrown into still water, touching shores we never knew existed, creating waves of mercy that would outlast them all.